Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-hosts, Mr. Patrick Farrell and Dr. Nicola Flanagan. How are you guys this week?
Fantastic.
Good, never been better.
Nicola's just on her sixth night of 7. Doctors are in the media a lot at the moment, and I actually see there was an article in the Independent, I think, the last couple of days about how much overtime junior doctors get, which is actually just hilarious because it's clearly like the media's opportunity to save face, saying like, "Oh, doctors are actually overpaid," while all the controversy about doctors being overworked is in the media. So, yeah, how are you feeling, Nicola? Are you feeling valued? Are you feeling appropriately supported in your work, appropriately reimbursed?
I'm feeling pretty terrible, to be honest. I definitely I don't want to do the overtime. Like, you just have to. So I definitely take less of that if it was going. But it's just not, unfortunately.
Yeah, it also just demonstrates the fact that healthcare is the worst run business in the world, that you'll pay one doctor the price of hiring 3 doctors instead of hiring at least one more doctor. But, c'est la vie. Today, we're not going to solve
on that as well. Like every other industry is like, after about 8 hours, we're just not really getting productive work from this person. Doctors, actually, you're in charge of, making sure we don't die. Yeah, we'll get 12 hours out of you.
Yeah. Delicate surgery, no problem. Let's go. But anyway, we won't solve those problems today. But what problems we will solve are those related to female training. So we're still ongoing with the female series of the podcast, and we've talked quite a bit about nutrition so far, and we want to move into a discussion about training. And this, of course, is an area that is rife with misunderstandings, misinformation at multiple different levels, because maybe when you first come into fitness as a woman, I don't know from personal experience, but maybe, do you know what? I'll end this up. Nicola, what's it like for a woman, yourself, and from experience speaking to others who've come to you in the gym, maybe, what's it like for them walking into a gym? It's generally male dominated. The weights area is generally male dominated. What's that experience like? What are people told? What are people scared of?
Yeah, so it's a funny one. I think it's been getting better in the last couple of years, but I know a lot of clients that would come to me. A lot of them are afraid to go into the gym. I've had a lot of girls in the past that, wanted to even lose weight before they go into the gym, that they, kind of want to drop body fat before they even step into the gym out of kind of, embarrassment or shame or whatever. And then when they do get in, it's again a battle of, whether they should be doing, HIIT classes, whether they should be doing resistance training, kind of what kind of resistance training. They don't want to get too bulky. There's a lot of kind of misinformation kind of on social media, in the media, etc. So there's a lot of, I think, apprehension of a lot of girls going into the gym. And then again, when you do go in, like you're saying, it's a very male dominated space still. So I think there's a lot of barriers.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, it's kind of easy to point at information as being the source of problems, maybe about like all women getting bulky and this sort of thing. But there's also kind of a broader, I think, social factor at play here, where it's self-reinforcing. Because if you look at, let's say, if you go into a gym and you just look around and you see all the women that I'm trying to be like are in a HIIT class, none of them are out here in the gym. So just like basic level 1 logic, I'm actually going to go to those HIIT classes. Same thing then if you observe maybe content that you see online, people doing these kind of so-called HIIT workouts, and it's like, oh, this is training for women. It's not necessarily that they're giving you any informational rationale as to why you should do this as a woman. It's more so just what you see. And that's why it comes back to that phrase that people always use, that representation matters. And when you see, for example, women in CrossFit, a lot more women weight training these days, and you see those examples online, I think it's not that people are citing studies and saying, oh, look, this is what happens when women weight train. It's more like, oh, I see that example. That's something I can look up to, and now I'm going to emulate that instead. So I think it's not just information that's important. It's also what you're seeing represented in society around you. And I think, as you say, That's probably something that has changed more in recent years, where if you do go into a gym, my expectation these days would be that, yeah, there probably will be women in the weight training area. Like, it's still going to be male dominated, but, you know, back even 10 years ago, it was far less common to see women going down to that area. And it was more common.
Just because I'm the oldest here, I'm going to say back in my day, you know,
Back in his day,
we didn't get that. You know, women didn't go to the weights area. You know, like any of the girls that I knew, like growing up, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to the gym," and you'd be like, what are you doing there? It might be a spin class. They might be doing like, you know, 40 minutes, 60 minutes on a cross trainer or something. It was never, I'm going to go in and, you know, do the weights area. You know, like some gyms that I've been in, like they've had dedicated like female training areas, but even in those dedicated female training areas, it's like, you know, up to 10 kilo dumbbells, you know, because you only want to tone, you know, you don't want to get like too big, you know, and it's like a load of fit balls and maybe some ab exercises, you know, but it's like, that's not the full extent of training, female training or training in general, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, for a lot of girls that I have, again, trying to get them more into resistance training, one thing that I kind of bring their attention to is, you know, with classes, they're very female focused. But at the end of the day, like, men and women are trying to do the same thing in the gym. We're all trying to, I suppose, not solely trying to improve body composition, but we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to build a little bit of muscle. But what's kind of happened, I suppose, with classes is that we've taken, you know, female muscle building, and we're using terms like tone, shape, sculpt to kind of make a female muscle building more palatable. So it's something that I always kind of bring their attention to. And like, we're actually trying to do the same thing in the gym. It's just, we just aren't at the stage where we can kind of accept that we're trying to, you know, build muscle, I suppose.
and to be fair, the language that people use when they market very simple terms like fat loss versus muscle hypertrophy definitely applies to both men and women here as well. Because if you're in the kind of male corner of the weight training internet, what you'll see is, you know, phrases like shredded, jacked, yoked, like all these different phrases that are used to describe things that we actually understand. Like when someone says jacked, I know what that means. When someone says shredded, I know what that means. If someone's saying like, are you going for more of a kind of an aesthetic or a bulky look? Again, I know what that means. So there is a certain extent of that that's allowable and that's understandable, because we don't all like want to be going around talking like these scientific nerds. It's like, what physique are you going for? It's like, well, I think if I had 8 kilos of muscle hypertrophy and then roughly 5 kilos of fat, like, you know, no one does that. They're like, yeah, I want that kind of jacked physique, you know? I was like, yeah, I get what you mean. So that applies to men and women. However, it can be very misleading because people do this to men as well. You know, they'll sell programs that are specifically for guys that want to get the jacked look or the aesthetic look, when in fact, like if you look at people who have, you know, an aesthetic look versus a bulky look, they just haven't built as much muscle yet. Like they're trying to get on that path, and they just have less muscle overall. And it's the same thing for women. But the problem is when those terms are used in a more of a kind of a marketing spin sense to justify practices that are actually just less efficacious. And in this case, it would be, instead of lifting heavy weights, you're lifting light weights that aren't really challenging you, but you're getting a sweat on and your heart rate's increasing. And it's like, yeah, okay, like there's a training effect, but you're actually diluting the effect that would lead the person to the physique that you're telling them you're giving them. In this case, whether it be sculpting or toning or shaping, like all those things effectively describe the process of increasing your muscle mass and losing body fat. That's typically what it means for a lot of people. If you've already got a good base of muscle mass, becoming more toned might mean just losing body fat. And in that case, the training doesn't really matter all that much. So there are no like specific toning exercises, shaping exercises, sculpting exercises. When you're choosing exercises to improve your physique, you have the option to increase muscle mass in a particular area. So you can absolutely shape your physique in the sense that you can do more shoulders versus doing more chest work, for example. But it's not like there's a specific shape that's added to the muscle by doing particular exercises over others. So I think that's an important entry point. A lot of our listeners probably know that, but maybe you're new to the gym, you're listening to this podcast and you're coming across all these terms. Just know that the exercises that are going to be effective for you as a woman trying to get more toned are actually the same as the bodybuilder who's trying to get to 400 pounds of muscle, you know?
Yes.
Yes.
So I suppose that kind of kicks it all off. And I'm going to start with the question, and you did kind of answer it, but let's actually break this down. Like, should men and women train in a different manner? Like, should we be, I don't know, like, say we're all trainers here. Like, we all train a lot of clients. I have male, female clients. We all have, different clients, right? Should we be programming? Should we be looking at the training that we employ with a woman and a man? Should we be looking at them differently? Is there something where we're like, okay, yeah, look, this is, I get my intake form. Oh, this is a woman. Here's how I train women. Now, obviously, there's going to be differences in terms of, what they want to achieve. Like a guy might want to build certain muscles or, have certain strength goals or whatever it is. And a woman might have, completely opposite ones. But either way, what are the actual differences, or are there any differences? Nicola, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think like it's a hard one to answer because it's yes and no. And I think first you have to look at it in a more broader sense. And it's not just, I suppose, male and female, but where is that person in their lifespan? A woman who's postnatal or postmenopausal is going to train completely different, not to say completely different, but different to someone who's, in their 20s. So I suppose it's first looking at kind of the lifespan, then looking at their goals. And even down within that, you have a lot of, societal differences and why women might train a little bit differently, which I know we touched on already. But, broadly speaking, the methods of muscle building, etc., are going to be the same. There are differences between men and women. Absolutely. There's, anatomical differences, physiological differences, which are important, and they're good to know. And I suppose we will go into more detail about those differences. But like I said, they're things that are good to know at the back of your head. But the most important thing, I suppose, as you listen to this podcast, is trying to coach the person that's in front of you, and not so much taking so much heed of these differences. Like I said, keeping them, observing them, keeping them in the background, but not, again, changing a whole program because it's a woman. You're looking at what their goals are, and broadly speaking, the general principles of getting the person from A to B are going to be pretty similar, if not the same.
And that kind of means that we're doing a certain amount of volume, and we're using, recovery, we'll say, as a proxy for the amount of volume we can do, right? We're like, okay, how well do you feel you're recovered? How well are you progressing? That's the same thing we do with all clients, regardless of their gender, sex, whatever, right? It's like we're looking at them and going, okay, you're actually under recovered from this, whatever, 100 sets of work that we're doing per week. You're actually just not recovering it well enough. So we need to modify things, right? But other than that modification, and we'll touch on that in a second again, but the real thing that we're focusing on a lot of the time is progressively overloading. We're actually going, okay, we have a certain amount of work that we need to do. This is the amount of work that you can recover from in terms of your schedule, in terms of your body's ability to adapt, in terms of, your desire to go to the gym, all of those different factors that play into it. You're like, this is a good level of training. Now, we might allocate the volume a little bit differently based on the goals. Like if I had a client that said, I want to build my chest, I'm not going to be like, right, well, we're doing half of our volume towards, arms or something. We're going to be like, okay, well, we want to focus a bit more on that. So we're going to put a little bit more volume towards that, right? But regardless of the gender, the sex of the individual, we're still focusing on progressive overload. And what that means is we're trying to, generally it plays out like we're trying to get stronger over time, right? So we're looking to slowly add weight to the bar, to the machine, to whatever over time. And I think this is one of the areas that women have kind of been sold a lie for a lot of the, health and fitness world. They basically been sold like, oh, just go in, get a good sweat on, use the 10-pound dumbbells. And once you're doing the exercise, like this is a shoulder exercise. Like once you're doing that and you feel a little bit of something working in your shoulders, cool. Just, really focus on racking up those, calories burned. When in reality, when we're training someone and when we're doing our own training, we're looking at, okay, this is the exercise that I want to perform. This is why I'm doing it. It could be for, the aesthetic appeal. It could be like, okay, I want to build these muscles. It could be for a strength reason. It could be posture. It could be whatever. But we're like, this is the exercise I'm doing. And every single week, every single month, every single year, I want to see that slowly trending up. I want to see, either my technique is improving, either my control, like I'm keeping a better tempo, or I'm able to be in control of the weight throughout the movement. Or what usually it looks like is, you're slowly adding a little bit more weight to the bar. And again, this is something that I find a lot of women are hesitant to do. They've been effectively lied to in terms of, it's like, oh, just do the exercise, doesn't matter about the weight. And then there's also this kind of, I don't know what you would say, like societal pressure. Like I remember I was training a client before, and I had her deadlifting, and she was deadlifting like 120 kilos for like 5 reps, and quite strong. And this is when I worked in like a college gym, and I think she was like 20 at the time, like that, something like that, and like a guy literally came over, and like I work in the gym, so I'm like, you would think, oh, like he knows what he's doing, blah blah blah. Guy came over and he's like, oh, should she be lifting that heavy, and it's like why would you say that to anyone in general? But then also, why would you say that to someone who's being trained in that moment and is clearly well capable to do that, But I feel like that's something that women experience a lot more of. So there's a variety of factors that are, culminating here to kind of prevent women from focusing on the one thing that's actually going to be the most important for their long-term progress, which is slowly getting stronger over time. Like no one wants to be weak forever, you want to get stronger. Like if I'm getting you to do some chin-ups, for example, and you're doing the exact same, strategy, like you're able to do one chin-up or something forever, like that's not really empowering. And we want to be in a position where you're like, okay, you can actually see the progress. And the only way we're going to do that is if we slowly get stronger. But what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, definitely. And that, like you're saying, that is a huge barrier with a lot of women. And like we've all experienced that in the gym, someone coming up to us being like, oh, you're lifting very heavy. I know another trainer came up to me one day deadlifting, being like, you shouldn't really be doing deadlifts, you're going to get a thick waist, as you get older, you can handle it now, there's a lot of that kind of language going around, again, that can, I suppose, perpetuate fear around lifting weights. But as well, like I'm always kind of hammering it back to social media as well. There's a lot of people, and again, like in fairness, it's probably how I started out as well, is looking at social media posts, but it's a lot of kind of random workouts, and it's just like, here's like a booty workout, or here's the shoulder workout, and what you'll see is a lot of girls coming in and just following a random workout, and then they'll go on to Instagram again and then follow another random workout, because that's what they're seeing a lot of people on Instagram doing, is people with big followings, and again, they're just posting different random workouts like every day, because again, that's what gets interaction on social media, that's what gets the likes. But actually what a lot of those fitness people on Instagram are doing, they're not actually following these workouts, they're just popping up this shoulder workout, but they probably have their own workout in the background that is does have progression in it and progressive overload. So that's kind of the things that you don't see. So I suppose there's a lot of like mismatch in communication there. So what you see someone doing on social media is actually might be completely different from what they're doing in their own training.
Yeah, and like it's understandable in terms of, you see this influencer doing this, and it's understandable to see them do that, because like imagine you literally posted the same, like let's say you train 4 days per week, right? And you're like, right, this is my lower body workout, and like every single week you're just posting the same lower body workout. People are going to be like, this is boring, I don't care about this, you do the same thing, I saw this exact same post last week. And like the only thing that's changing in that is, they might either get a couple extra reps here and there, or they might be lifting a slightly heavier weight. And people are looking at that going, that's not like sexy, that's not like flashy, that's not like, oh, there's a new exercise that I've never seen, for training the glutes or training this muscle group or whatever. You're like, oh, I'm definitely going to try that, And again, that happens to guys as well, but I definitely feel that women are exposed to that way more. And it really does, in my opinion and my experience, like really does hold women back. Like if you're just doing these random workouts, like, yeah, look, we all have a bias towards getting people to exercise in whatever manner that looks like. I'm like, I think all of us would agree that I would rather see someone in the gym doing a random workout than just sitting at home doing nothing, But it gets people to focus on the wrong thing, gets people to focus on like, oh, I just need to have this like calorie burn. I just need to feel like I'm sweating. I just need to feel like, I just worked really hard in the gym, when in reality, it's like you can do so much more. Like you're putting in all this effort, you're putting in all this time, and you're just not getting the results that you want because we're not actually focusing on the right stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have any thoughts there, Gary?
Oh, straight facts, man. Completely agree. I mean, the same thing happens in with guys, like, you know, you'll have, oh, try this giant set or this shoulder burner workout, which in isolation just does absolutely nothing. So, you know, you'll come across like that. They are the things that trend, as Nicola alluded to, that, you know, if you've got a booty workout or an ab workout when you're lean, for example, like those things always trend because the person's generally showing off their physique, just masquerading it as a workout advice. But when you put those things in as part of a well-constructed program, that's perfectly fine. And I think if you understand the purpose of exercise content on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, and you see, all right, this is one workout, but this is just one workout in a whole series of many months and years of training that I need to be doing. If you can put that in context and apply all the principles that we've discussed in terms of progressive overload, etc., then that's perfectly fine. But don't think that there's any one special workout structure that's going to get you that body you desire. The reality is that most men or women who build physiques that are admirable, they do a lot of the same stuff with very small variations here or there for many, many years. You know, it's about celebrating the extra rep that you got. It's about celebrating the extra 2.5 kilos on the bar per month, the extra 1 chin up that you got. These are the realities of progression. And it's very difficult to see that sometimes on social media. There are some people that I follow who've been training for 10, 15, 20 years. And if they get like one significant personal best on their main lift per year, they're pretty happy about that. And that's just the reality of long-term training. And most of their workouts, if you go on their pages, you'll see them doing barbell squats, doing barbell squats, doing barbell squats, and then they're doing maybe a front squat and a safety bar squat. But when they're trying to improve their squat strength or they're trying to build their lower body muscle mass, most of their training is pretty much the exact same, especially when it comes to like strength and powerlifting work. But even if you go to the physique side of things, I think one of the good examples on Instagram that is incredibly boring is probably Dr. Mike Israel's Instagram page. Like he posts his training all the time, but like it's literally just like him doing almost the same exercises, almost the same weight, like all of the time. Like here's my AM Thursday workout, here's my PM Thursday workout. And then people will ask him questions about, oh, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And he's just like, it's week 3 of my mesocycle and I've added 1 set. Here are my RIR targets or whatever. And it just seems so boring and bland, but it's the reality of the training that actually leads to significant progress, even if it doesn't seem very sexy at face value.
And especially with like physique development, like you're going to find, here's a handful of exercises that really work well for my body, you know, and really work well for my goals. Like, why are you going to be doing all these random exercises that are potentially less effective? They're not really, you know, great for your body. Like, yeah, they still get a nice stimulus, but it's not like, it's very hard to get stronger on them. Like you're going to see people, okay, these are bread and butter exercises. I respond really well to them. I find I get a really good connection with them. Like, why would you just throw them out every single week? Oh, just rotate away, get rid of that exercise, bring something else in. Like, stick to the stuff that, you know, targets the muscles you want to target, targets the adaptations you want to target, that work really well for your body, and just get brutally strong on all of them, right? Like that's the way, you know, you progress with training over the years, you know. But this brings me to the next question, and this is a common question you see in the female physique world, anyone in the health and fitness industry that either trains clients that are women or that are women themselves. Like, when we're talking about rate of progression, right? When we talk about it in terms of, you know, guys training in the gym, there's kind of this thought process of like, oh, well, I'm just going to keep adding weight to the bar every week, right? Every single week, just add a little bit extra to the bar, whether it's, you know, 1.25 kilos either side, even if it's like, you know, micro plates, it's like half a kilo per side, whatever. Which, just as an aside, as a woman, micro plates and any of those kind of like very small loadable plates, game changer, right? Which kind of goes in with this discussion. But when we're talking about that kind of rate of progression, what's realistic for a woman to expect versus a man? Because, you know, men tend to progress with training a lot quicker, right? And there's a variety of, like, you know, physiological reasons for that. But how do we actually, you know, interpret that boots on the ground, like we're actually in the gym? What are we actually going to do about that information? Are you going to go, okay, well, I can't progress every week, or am I just going to go try for smaller progressions? Like, how are we actually dealing with that? What's your experience there, Nicola?
Yeah, so if you look at men and women, particularly kind of younger men and women kind of under the age of 35, you'll actually see women progressing a little bit more quickly in the gym, kind of both untrained. And that probably comes down to women start off at, I suppose, a lower strength level. Particularly, I suppose guys might kind of grow up a little bit more athletic and might have a baseline kind of larger muscle mass.
It's also probably because guys are idiots. So they'll just go into the gym and be like, yeah, of course I can, you know, the kilos on the bar there, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And girls will have a lower upper body muscle mass in comparison to men as well. So you will see a bigger strength gain or muscle mass gain early on initially with women. But then after that, yeah, it will, I suppose, come down to more of a fear of weights, not knowing how to push it. Again, a lot of women won't be involved in sports when they're younger. So if you think even guys at GA training, you're still probably doing things like push-ups, you're still doing, you know, kind of body weight exercises, kind of warming up. So they probably have even more kind of neuromuscular control starting off than women would. So I think there's a few more issues kind of like with neuromuscular control, proprioception with women starting off. Again, just if that kind of base from sports isn't there early on. So yeah, it's fear of weights and those things as well. And starting off at a lower muscular mass base as well.
And then when we're actually in the gym, like say you're training someone, like, are you pushing them every single week to be like, right, where is the progression? What are we looking for here? You know, like obviously, and we'll touch on it in a moment, we also have to layer on the menstrual cycle. But, you know, in general, what are we looking at here? What are we looking at in terms of a rate of progression? Because obviously, look, this is hugely dependent on where you are in your training career, you know, what you're actually aiming towards. But are we looking at, you know, you've given this program to this woman, are you going, right, I want to see you slowly start increasing the weight? When you're saying that to them, like, what's your expectation and what's the expectation you find they have? You know, are they thinking like, oh, slowly increase the weights? Are they thinking, oh, that means 5 kilos over the next, you know, 10 months? Or are they thinking like, that means 5 kilos next week?
Yeah, so one of the conversations that I'll have in the beginning is, I suppose, different ways that we can progress in the gym. So whether that's adding on weights, whether that's, you know, adding volume, or whether that's just getting better at the movement. So that's a huge one as well. I think that's underappreciated, and it'll be different between exercises as well. I'll be like, okay, for this one, we're trying to work more on movement quality. Maybe we're trying to work more on movement quality for squats. Maybe for things like RDL, that's maybe something that we're trying to move up in weight with. But what I'll generally coach in the beginning is there will be a bigger increase in strength in the beginning. So maybe at the start, once we have an RDL down, maybe we will be adding 5 kg each side to the bar. And then after that, that starts to slow down. But again, we're looking at things like reps in reserve. We're looking at kind of form breakdown and how well that they recover from the sessions. So we'll be looking at a bigger rate of progression in the beginning, like I said, maybe kind of 5 kgs each side, and then after that it'll slow down, but it'll just again depend on the individual.
Yeah, I think something that's really important here as well is that when we talk about rates of progression, both in terms of like when we're discussing it as coaches, but also often in research, it's the way it's quantified. We're talking about relative changes in strength. So this actually becomes really important at lower levels of strength, because if you're starting off, let's say, and you're only doing overhead presses with, let's say, the bar, okay, you're just doing the bar, which is actually difficult enough for people starting out. That's 20 kilos. So for you to add 5 kilos, which is just 2.5 per side, looks like absolutely nothing. but that's a 25% increase in load on the bar. Like that is a lot. Like if any advanced lifter who, let's say they overhead press 80 kilos, like there's not a chance in the world that they're expecting to see 100 kilos on the bar anytime soon. You know, it's just not going to happen.
And so it's even more apparent with dumbbells, you know.
Yeah.
It's like you go from a 10 kilo dumbbell to a 12.5 kilo dumbbell. You're like, that's still a 25% fucking increase there.
Exactly. So that's something that you really do have to keep in mind if you're starting off from a lower level, because very often, even like weight training machines, the jumps in weight that we use, they're actually pretty much standard at lower and higher weights. So that's something that's quite difficult to recalibrate. You know, you will see that on some machines, the intervals that you can change, you know, on the selectorized machines are smaller as you get to the lower weights, but some of them aren't. So that can be something that's difficult to deal with. And that's why Paddy's suggesting things like micro plates, because you're able to, or micro loading, because you're able to make smaller little jumps. And if that's not something you have access to, what I often suggest to people when they're trying to apply progressive overload, like let's say they're that person with the 20 kilo overhead press, I would start with just trying to add a rep. You know, try to add a rep next week. Week after, let's add a rep to 2 of our sets. Week after, let's add a rep to 3 of our sets. And we'll just bump up the reps until we're at the point where we're doing, let's say, 2 to 4 more reps, which might correlate with us being able to add that 5 kilos to the bar. So that's something you have to do as well. As a woman or as anyone that's starting off at a lower level of strength relative to the standard jumps and weight that are available in the gym. Because yeah, that's just something that's super important.
And on that as well, like you do see this all the time, or guys, girls, regardless, you know, if you get stuck at that a certain weight and the next jump up can be really hard to hit. And then like you're doing, like Gary said there, you're like, okay, I'm just going to add some reps over time. You know, I can't really add weight. The next jump up in weight, it's, you know, 5 kilos and there's just no way I'm getting that, you know, like you might be able to add a couple of reps over time, but some people, you know, certainly on some exercises, even adding a rep can be really difficult, you know? And so in those circumstances, we would generally do either one of two things. Either we would just start lower, like do a lower intensity in terms of like keep like 3 reps in reserve at all times. You know, if you've got 3 reps in reserve, you know, you definitely have 3 reps to build over time, you know, but even still, you do that, you could still get to the stage where all of your sets are kind of like at 0 reps in reserve, you got to the max. And where do you go from there? And generally what we'll do then is we'll just add a set, you know, and we might build up the reps that way in terms of you were doing 3 sets of 8, you know, you've maxed out the amount of weight you can lift for that. You can't do another rep with any of those. Okay, we're just going to do another set, you know, and we might even only do like 3 reps on that set, you know, and we're just going to build up the reps of that until we're at 4 sets of 8, you know, and then you'll see the progress over time. Because when we're talking about progressive overload, it really is just about doing a little bit more than you have previously done, you know, like staying at that kind of capacity of this is my maximum ability. I'm just a little bit below that, so that you're slowly inching that maximum capacity up and up and up, you know. So we just want to look at some sort of progression all times, you know. And again, people get so confused by this because they see people in the gym and they don't see the small progressions. They don't see the, oh, I added like 1.25 kilos here and a 1.25 kilos here. And, you know, I just clicked added a small amount of weight, you know, like say some machines have those little weights that you can add on to them, you know, it's like a half a kilo or something, you know, like those things, you don't really see that over time. You just see, oh, they're doing the chest press machine again. You know, you don't see that, oh, they've actually just increased it a little bit or they got an extra rep here. And again, that's the boring stuff, you know, but that's the actual stuff that produces the results that we want, right? So again, in my mind, at least when we're looking at male and female training, like you might see a slower rate of return in absolute terms when we're talking about women, because you might not see like a guy might be like, oh, I'll just jump up 5 kilos, but you still see relatively similar actual rate of return, you know, like relative, I suppose would be the word, where it's like you're increasing like 1 to 2% each week, you know, but obviously if you're starting at 20 kilos versus starting at 100 kilos, like you're going to see the actual 1 to 2% a lot quicker in the 100 kilos, you know. But related to this, especially because we've just talked about, you know, the overall training plan, are we looking at doing more volume for women, right? Because there's 2 reasons we could potentially recommend this. And in some research, you know, you see this elucidated and in people's experiences, you also see this kind of elucidated and also alluded to. And that's like a women need to do more volume, right? They can handle more volume. Now, again, we can get into physiological reasons for that, but I actually think that's less important than the actual practical on the ground stuff, right? And when we're talking about handling more volume, usually that means more work in general, right? It's not necessarily like the intensity, it's not the weights lifted, but it's the amount of sets done, it's the amount of reps done, it's all that kind of stuff added together, right? So when we're looking at that, are we looking at this and going, you know, women need to do more volume, or women can do more volume, so we should give them more volume, right? Should we be doing more sets, more reps? Now, obviously, look, people have real lives. They don't want to be in the gym 6 days per week. So there's a practical aspect of it there. But that aside, what are we thinking on the volume stuff?
Yeah, so I think that there's still, like you're saying, there's a ceiling with this. And it just comes back to the individual. Like, you know, someone's volume is going to, the amount of volume one woman can handle can be completely different to someone else. And I think just prescribing more isn't necessarily better. It's whatever someone can recover from and what fits into their schedule mostly. That's the way that I would think about it anyway. And I definitely wouldn't prescribe more volume to someone just because they're a woman. I think that classically comes from the idea that women have more type 1 muscle fibers and the slow twitch ones. I think that's generally where that idea comes from, which I think what we're seeing now is that a lot of studies are saying that there actually isn't a difference really between men and women with the distribution of the type 1 and the type 2. So the more volume thing isn't classically something that I would prescribe, I suppose.
100%. Gary, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I mostly agree. I think that volume for me, at least in practice, it's never really about reaching the ceiling of what I can get the person to do. It's almost always a practical concern. You know, how long can I keep someone's interest in the gym? How much time can they allocate to the gym? At least with my clients, like I know that when you encounter some bodybuilding clients, that they will just do as much volume as you want them to do. But yeah, I don't run into that issue too much. Now, in terms of like just empirically, I think there is evidence and physiological basis to suggest that at higher rep ranges, women maintain their performance a bit better. So for example, at 70% of 1RM, you might expect a woman to get more reps if taken to failure. But again, that's something that's going to vary a lot based on past training experience and everything. So I think that's hard to say. Like you do see as well that, you know, at basically the closer you go to the extreme endurance events, the more the sex differences start to wash out. So whereas at the maximal power and strength side of things, men will obviously dominate there. So that there are clear physiological differences. I just don't think that there's enough juice there really to justify actually, you know, making prophylactic changes in training programming. You know, I would be reactive in that sense, in the sense that if I'm observing, male or female, that a person needs more volume, I'll give them more volume. If they need less, I'll give them less. But I'm not going into programming for a client thinking, right, this person's female, so I'm going to increase their volume by 5 to 10% or 20% or whatever. It's just not something I do anyway.
Yeah, and this is the thing as well, like estrogen seems to be glucose sparing, right? So this could just be an artifact of the fact that women potentially have a little bit more juice left in the tank, you know, compared to a guy. So if you get a guy to do, you know, 3 sets and he's absolutely gassed at the end of it, like because of the beneficial effect of estrogen on, you know, maintaining glucose, you might have a woman do the same 3 sets and be like, my performance is still higher at the end of that because they weren't tapping into as much glucose, you know, if this exercise demands glucose, you know, whereas the guy wasn't tapping into as much fat stores, you know. So that is one thing which kind of makes sense. But again, it comes down to a practical thing here where I'm like, look, realistically, most people have 40 minutes to an hour to train, you know. So I'm not going to be like, oh, well, just because you're a woman, you need to do 20% more, you know, just just because, you know, your hormones and stuff, you know, it's like, it doesn't really bear out in the actual practical real world. So we're going to set a program, be like, right, how's your recovery? How's your progression? Okay, cool. All of that stuff is on point. Cool. Well, why would we necessarily need to do more? Now, we can definitely fill in a bit more if you're like, okay, you know what, I actually want to work on these muscles and I feel my recovery is good. I feel like I'm not, you know, anywhere near my maximal recovery capacity or maximal training capacity. So I want to do a bit more. We still take into account that recovery capacity. We still take into account the practical, like, oh, you've 60 minutes to train, but we might be able to add a little bit more volume in other areas in terms of, we might do something like a superset. You might do like, oh, I want to, you know, train my glutes a bit more. We're training upper body and we're pairing that with some lighter lower body stuff, just to get a little bit more blood flow to the area, get a little bit more tension on the muscles, that kind of stuff. Like, I sometimes do that with clients, but in general, look, realistically, we're still sticking to the very same principles and practicalities when we're designing a training program. Now, Gary, you said something interesting, which I actually don't know if I 100% agree with, which is, well, you said it in terms of absolute, but I know people will get onto it and be like, what's the story there? But in terms of like the strength potential between men and women, right? Is there actually a difference here? Right? Because like, obviously, like, let's just use, I don't know, like powerlifting, right? If we're just saying like, that's what strength means, you know, like objectively, the guys are lifting heavier weights, right? They simply are, right? But is this just an artifact of lean muscle mass, right? So if you have a woman, you know, like, let's say even like you're a tall woman, you know, you're like 6'2" or something, right? Generally speaking, if you compare the same two athletes, like a 6'2" male and a 6'2" female, like, the male is going to have more muscle mass. Now, this is an artifact of, you know, androgens are just, you know, great at building muscle. That's why athletes take them. So there's that. But overall, is there a difference here? Now, we can get into the anatomy, and this is why I'm asking you, Gary, but then also I want to just see in terms of like your experience as well, Nicola, here, in terms of, you know, you see people training in the gym, you're a woman yourself, you talk to women. What are your thoughts, Gary? Is there an anatomical reason that women are not going to be able to reach the strength potential of a guy, right? Versus, is this just an artifact of, you know, lean muscle mass? Like, if you were just to, you know, equate for lean mass or equate for androgen load, is it the same? What are your thoughts, Gary?
In terms of, in like powerlifting?
Well, just in terms of strength, I'm saying like powerlifting is obviously like, you know, 1 RM, blah, blah, blah. Now, see, this obviously this argument gets very convoluted because there's a whole host of factors that go into it. For example, like androgens are great at, you know, giving you more drive, you know, giving you more like hyped up central nervous system, like stimulation. So like, again, like, that's why certain drugs like androgens, they take them before powerlifting meets, like halotestin and stuff, you know. But anyway, just in general, Gary, strength, whatever way you want to talk about it, whether it's absolute, relative, whatever.
Yeah, so my previous comment, I said that men are going to dominate on the strength and power side of things, and that's absolutely true from an absolute perspective. Like, there's no real debating that. However, in terms of the, like, if you were to, as you look at more relative measures and you correct for more things, I think, like, as you said, I think lean body mass is probably the biggest predictor of strength. And that also goes for within sex differences in terms of, if you look at male powerlifting performance, the biggest predictor of being stronger is having more muscle mass, you know? So it's not like there's some magic ingredient to strength beyond muscle mass. There are other things that are at play. As you said, testosterone has significant psychological effects, both in terms of being like the presence of testosterone and androgens in the moment, but also long term in terms of shaping one's psychology. Like, there are specific androgenic effects over time, for example, like male aggression and, as you say, drive here in this case. So those things
that, like, both of us are absolute fucking idiots because we've been exposed to testosterone our whole life.
Yeah, risk taking, etc. So yeah, that is there, and that probably does play some role in performance differences. There are also effects of hormones on, for example, connective tissue remodeling. So even the strength of collagen, the laxity of ligaments, which is one of many reasons why there are sex differences in, for example, ACL injury rates much higher in women. So there are these physiological things that will determine collagen and connective tissue strength. Connective tissue is not just tendons and ligaments, it also runs within your muscles and is responsible for force distribution longitudinally, but also in a transverse manner. So there's those connective tissue aspects. There's also bone strength sides to this. Now, I don't think this plays too much of a role in performance differences in strength. Men do typically have higher bone mineral density. There is some bone to muscle crosstalk. Again, hard to say if that plays a significant role here. More broadly, anatomically, there are clearly differences in the male and female skeleton. So there are differences, especially when you look at pelvic girdle width and hip width, Q angle, etc. There are these things in the lower body that determine strength performance, and also like levels of muscle mass in different parts of the body. So I would expect a woman to do a lot better in terms of maintaining relative strength standards compared to a man in lower body lifts than I would with upper body lifts. You see that a lot with women who have ridiculously impressive squat and deadlift strength, and maybe the bench ends up lagging behind in a powerlifting perspective. So I think overall, I think there probably are residual effects beyond just muscle mass that probably account for males being stronger, even in a relative sense. But I think when you break things down to the relative level and you correct for some of those things, I think a woman can still expect to get incredibly strong if she trains hard. What do you think, Paddy?
Well, I personally look like an inverted pyramid. So my shoulders are like this and my waist is like this. You don't really see that in women. So clearly there's like anatomical differences that are going to, benefit me in certain aspects. And there's going to be anatomical differences that benefit women in certain aspects. But I always find that when you do kind of correlate or you correct for a lot of these things, especially lean mass, like it kind of becomes a wash. Now that's a little bit different when we talk about like sporting performance. Like that's a little bit different than strength, especially when we're talking about like relative strength. Like, if you're a 50 kilo female, like obviously you're not going to be as strong as a 100 kilo male or 100 kilo female. There's going to be differences there. But if we're talking about 50 kilo male, 50 kilo female, like if we correct for muscle mass and a few other things, it kind of becomes fairly similar. It's not a huge difference, at least in my experience. Again, different from a sporting context because there's a few other things in terms of, the brain stuff as well as like just hormonal stuff in general. But what are your thoughts, Nicola?
Yeah, definitely. I think just echoing exactly what you guys said. And I think guys as well, I think we have the same amount of muscle fibers. So I think with guys, there's a greater cross-sectional area. So I suppose that could have a potential to produce more force as well.
Yeah. And I think that as well, like what you touched on there, Paddy, is that like power, when you look at powerlifting, and also if you look at extreme endurance events, you end up washing out some of the sex differences. Like ultimately what you do is, if you look at strength, like in powerlifting, it's about as pure representation of strength as you'll get. When you look at extreme endurance, you're getting the purest representation of just like basic cardiorespiratory physiology as you'll get. Whereas when you get into more complex sports, like for example, the NFL or rugby and these types of things, now you're dealing with many different components of fitness that are colliding together, and you see far more significant sex differences. So that's something that's quite interesting. Like again, if you go to, you might know more about this than me, Paddy, but I think shooting as well is an area where you see very similar between males and females in like competitive shooting, because again, what you're doing there is you're just washing it down to like very specific skills, and you're taking away the kind of chaos. So you might say that women just can't handle chaos, or I'm only joking.
But in
But
shooting, like, women actually sometimes have an advantage because they generally have a lower resting heart rate.
yeah,
That's one of the main determinants of shooting success, you know. But it's interesting as well because, again, you're saying, oh, maybe it's the chaos thing. I know you're saying that jokingly, but like there's a reason they even have, like, in chess, there's differences. Like, there are different leagues for women and for men. But that's not necessarily because, oh, like, men, big brain, we're smart, blah, blah, blah. It's because, like, men are more like women are more risk averse, you know, so men will take these risks, and as a result, like, they're able to, or they do things in a chess game that women wouldn't do, you know. So it's like, it actually becomes an unfair advantage. This is why they also do in, like, testing in, like, schools these days, they don't do that negative marking, you know, because that disadvantages women, because guys are like, fuck it, negative marking, who cares?
let's go.
They don't care. Whereas women are like, oh, like, I'll actually have to weigh up the consequences here. I actually have to think whether this is a smart move to just fucking tick the box, you know? So there's so many, when we're talking about complex sport, there's so many variables that go into this that it's like, you can't just break it down to the actual, like, physical body, you know?
Yeah, women are not dumb enough to do the stupid shit that's required in some sports, you know. So I think that's the take home point.
Is what it is.
But they're a victim of their own brains. But we've been talking about resistance training a lot. Are there any differences in terms of cardiovascular training? Right? Is there anything that we should be thinking about there? Because in my experience, not really. Like, I don't really see anything that I'd be like I know a lot of people, and we're going to touch on this next. People are like, oh, well, there's differences in terms of hormones across the menstrual cycle, so we should maybe do certain types of training at certain stages. But in general, if we're just talking about the training that people do, you know, whether it's aerobic training, anaerobic training, whatever, like, I don't really see a huge difference. But what are your guys' thoughts?
So I suppose with cardiovascular training, I wouldn't see there are differences in, like, VO2 max and that kind of thing between men and women. Like we were saying about resting heart rate, even blood pressure. Like, so women have, when corrected for body size, muscle mass, they'll still have about 10% lower VO2 max. But how that kind of translates into practice, like, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I wouldn't really consider it when programming for my clients at all. And I wouldn't, I know we're going to talk about the menstrual cycle as well, but it's not really something that I'd hugely consider cardiovascular training within the menstrual cycle either.
Yeah, VO2 max is a pretty shit marker, to be honest. I just don't use it really. Well, it's a nice little proxy there. Like, Apple Watch gives you your VO2 max based on your walking. So I'm like, yeah, it's cool to know, but I'm not going to go in and fucking start testing this in a lab and stuff, you know? But Gary, what are your thoughts on cardiovascular training for women?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that comes to mind here, as I suppose a consideration, would be the higher risk and higher rate of occurrence of bone stress injuries and relative energy deficiency in is it in sport or syndrome? What do they call it these days? REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. Yeah, sport. Basically, all of the, we did a podcast on this recently enough, I think, but all of the downside of having relative energy deficiency, they seem to be magnified to some degree in women. Now, it's not necessarily that men can't get bone stress injuries and be on that spectrum. They absolutely can. It just seems that, you know, women have a higher risk here, and it's something that I would be concerned in women who are doing a lot of running or taking up a lot of running as a new activity. In particular, it's something that I actually had a couple of consultations with Triage in relation to during the pandemic, because we had a few lifters who had come to us who had taken up running because they hadn't been lifting. And, you know, you saw early on in the pandemic that a lot of people were just going out and running as much as they could because they had nothing else to do. And there was a few cases of, you know, medial tibial stress syndrome and stress fractures, tibial stress fractures as a result of that. So that is something that can be of concern for women. And naturally, along with that, with endurance training more generally, the amenorrhea is another, you know, big thing that's of relevance there. So if you are doing a lot of cardio training, it's obviously very energy intensive. One of the things about cardio training is that you can go out and do, you know, 4 hours of cardio, and eat yourself back to feeling pretty good. You know, no one's going to do 4 hours of weight training to failure, but you can do 4 hours of cardio. And that can lead to very significant energy deficits, low energy availability, and the consequences as a result of that. So that's the only thing that massively comes to mind. Again, I'm not programming cardio differently really between men and women otherwise.
Yeah, and we'll come back to the amenorrhea stuff, but before we get onto that stuff, we actually have to just be like, right, here's a normal menstrual cycle, you know, a regularly cycling woman. You know, they always say, again, this archetypical 28 days. It's never like perfectly 28 days, but we're going to use that as the, you know, the, oh, here's how it works, you know, the whatever. But are we changing our training as a result of that? Because you see a lot of this in the research these days. You see this a lot in, you know, we'll say forward thinking individuals that are trainers. They're like, okay, you know, the menstrual cycle is something we should take account of. So how do we take account of that, you know, with our training? And there's all these, you know, relatively complex systems devised, protocols. They're like, well, during this stage of your cycle, you know, you're more likely to, you know, not be able to handle volume, for example, or this part of your cycle, you're going to be able to express your true strength a bit more. During this stage, you know, you're better able to oxidize fats. This stage, you're able to better oxidize glucose, and they'll change the cardiovascular training as a result of that. But what are your thoughts on this? Because, like, obviously I know my own thoughts on this and, you know, how I program for clients, but Nicola, what are your, where are you starting with this? Is this something that, like, obviously we've talked about it before in terms of this is something we take into account. We're like, this is something that we need to know, but how are we modifying the training as a result of that? Are we modifying it straight off the bat going in, or is it something that we're modifying after the fact?
Yeah, so I'm really enjoying a lot of the research that's coming out, and I think it's really showing. It's great that we're showing more of an interest in menstrual cycle and how it relates to training. So as we know, a lot of the earlier research was all just involved with men, and then we were just trying to translate that research into women. And as we know, with the menstrual cycle, it didn't perfectly translate, and we know that there are more sex differences than we probably originally thought. But overwhelmingly at this stage, the research doesn't point to that there's any massive benefit to programming training for the menstrual cycle. But I think that the differences in between the different phases, I think they are good to know in the background of your head. There's something to observe, but definitely I will never program someone based off their menstrual cycle from like the get-go. If they sign up and they're a woman, I'm like, okay, we're doing menstrual cycle training, you know. It's definitely not something that I would do. But through tracking the different phases, the different days, how they're feeling, kind of sleep, stress, how their training feels at different stages in their cycle, that is something that we will then begin to adjust. And I think that's like a relatively fair thing to do. So I don't know, do you want me to kind of go through the different phases and what kind of the research is?
Why not?
Why not? Here we go. So like you're saying, typical 28 days. We know that that's not typical for every woman, split into two main phases. So we have our follicular phase and then our luteal phase. We have a couple of different hormones that kind of rise and fall throughout that. So right bang in the middle, you've ovulation as well. So the first half, our follicular phase, the first 5 days are menstruation. Our hormones are typically flatlined, estrogen and progesterone being the two main hormones. Again, just to simplify it, I'll just talk about those two. So the first couple of days during menstruation, those two are kind of flatlined. And our hormonal profile, I suppose, most closely resembles a man at this stage. And then after that, you see estrogen start to rise, and that's typically our anabolic hormone. So during the first half, the follicular phase, what the research, what a lot of people are suggesting is that we can handle more volume here, and that we can handle heavier loads. So you'll be hitting more PBs, and that's due to that rise in estrogen. So then you hit the middle of the cycle, ovulation, and again that's where you're seeing the biggest peak in estrogen. And again, people are saying hit your PBs during this time. And then during the second half, the luteal phase, where we have more of a progesterone predominance, again, estrogen is still rising. It's fallen, when it's rising again, it's reaching its secondary peak. And we see a reduced ability to recover. So we were saying, kind of decrease volume, maybe do other forms of exercise like yoga or, brisk walking, that sort of thing. You'll also be hitting kind of PMS symptoms during the second half of the luteal phase, again, which have its own psychological impact on training. But overwhelmingly, each woman's menstrual cycle looks so different, and those fluctuations in hormones and how they affect every woman is so different. So it's not something, again, a client that comes to me that does predominantly strength training programming like brisk walking for their second half of the cycle, when maybe PMS symptoms aren't something that really affects them, it isn't appropriate. So I think it's good to keep in the background of your head. And I suppose particularly if you are a male coach coaching a female client, to know that PMS symptoms might be rising at a certain time, or how the menstruation, like the first days of the period, how they can affect a woman between, again, mood, between cramps, lightheadedness, whatever it is. And not saying, hey, the research said that actually HIIT training is really good during your period and someone's like doubled over with cramps, so it is nice to, again, have at the back of your head, but I wouldn't program off it in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, 100%. And Gary, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, like something that you'll see probably as like a recurring theme in the things I talk about in my social media are the effects of suggestion on how you feel. So I'm very interested in like placebo and nocebo type of effects, and how information delivered by healthcare professionals or others impacts how you feel day to day. We've talked about this so much on the podcast in relation to like pain, posture, injury rehab, those types of things. But it's also very, very relevant here, because like an example that I, would have used earlier in the week is, if you're talking about sleep, you tell people who've slept the exact same, let's say, you tell half of them that they've slept above average amounts of REM sleep, and you tell them all about the benefits of that. You tell the other half that they've slept below average sleep, and then you assess their cognitive functioning thereafter. Those who have been told that they slept better perform better. Those that have been told they've slept worse perform worse. So what they're told manifests in real life in terms of differences in how they act and how they function cognitively. And the same thing happens here, or can happen here, with the menstrual cycle. So if you're reading all this information about when you're going to be weakest, when you're going to be strongest, etc., you'll probably fulfill that prophecy, because you're going to be going into your workouts on the days where you've been told you're going to perform poorly, with little expectation of yourself. And you're going to be thinking, you're going to be maybe a bit more aware. Oh, I heard this triage guys say that back pain is worse during my period. You know what? Actually, now that I pay attention to it, it actually is kind of bad. They're the types of things that start to happen. So I think you can find a happy medium here, where you realize that physiology absolutely is real. Like, you can't just think your way out of these things. And for you may very well have very distinct differences in performance, but I would still go into each session with the expectation of, yeah, I'm going to perform well, no big deal, let's go. And not to, expect yourself to be performing poorly, even if it's just based on last month. Because that's one of the things you see in menstrual cycle research more generally, is that you'll see studies published on like premenstrual syndrome, or even PMDD, like basically symptoms related to the menstrual cycle. You'll see them published based on a single cycle. And there's not just massive variation between women, but there's also massive variation within women between cycles in the occurrence of these symptoms. Same thing goes for performance. So don't just think, oh, I tracked my cycle last month and I had a bad day in the gym. That's going to be the case going forward, because we know there's massive variation. And that also occurs on the physiological level as well. When you look at the hormonal variations, both in terms of the absolute levels of ovarian hormones and the relative changes in those throughout the cycle, that also varies between cycles. So trying to be like really dial in your tracking of your cycle, very, very difficult thing to do. Something that's worth doing to some extent, like you're saying, Nicola, to notice if you're having specific symptoms or specific declines in performance, but notice them as little mental notes first. Like, don't notice them with the expectation that that is now your destiny from cycle to cycle.
Yeah, 100%. Go on, Nicola.
No, it's just with my own clients, the way that I would track it isn't so much. We would track, I suppose, if there's a strength increase with any session, and just another section will be what day of the cycle is. So we're not trying to necessarily find a correlation between them. It's just taking the whole picture, and as well, you're not looking someone's performance, like you're not looking at the menstrual cycle in isolation of someone's performance. Like, you also obviously have other factors like your stress, like your sleep, how they're eating. And I know all of those systems can play on each other, but I think putting everything down to the menstrual cycle again just isn't the right way to go about it.
And this is going to be, in my opinion, at least, going to be more and more important as we get more technologically advanced. Because, like, say, for example, like I have a Whoop. I know Gary has a Whoop. I don't know if you do, Nicola, but like they have now introduced like a temperature tracking, right? And that's something that you could use to see where you are in your cycle, or at least use as a kind of proxy. Now, I don't know if it's externally validated or scientifically validated to use it for that purpose, but I could definitely, if I was a businessman, which I am, I would be like, that's something that you could easily sell to women as, oh, this is going to help you really understand your cycle, really understand where you are in your cycle, because your temperature does change throughout your cycle. So we could use that as a proxy. And if you're starting to get all these tracking devices and different things that are telling you, just like HRV, for example, and it's like, oh, your performance is going to be shit today, like Gary was saying, like that can really throw you off. If you're getting, oh, you have this new female fitness tracker watch thing, whatever, and it's telling you, yeah, you're going to have shit performance today, you're probably going to have shit performance that day if you really buy into it. So that is something that you need to really be aware of and really pay attention to. And again, I think it's going to become more and more important as we get through the industrial revolution that we're currently in. But I want to finally just touch on this point related to how we're managing this stuff in a more practical way. And I know we all kind of do this in different ways. We just teach auto-regulation, right? So rather than being like, all right, you're in week 3, this is what we can expect, we're going into sessions going like, yeah, you're going to base your, the weights you choose, you're going to base like how much work you do based on how you're feeling, how you feel recovered, how well your sleep was, all of that kind of stuff. So we're auto-regulating our training, and some days we might do a little bit more. We're really feeling it. We're really like, yes, I want to push the weights this session. Some days you're going to be like, you know what, actually my sleep last night wasn't great. My stress is a bit higher, and I'm feeling some PMS symptoms. I'm going to take it a little bit easier in the gym. So we're using some form of auto-regulation, and that could look like using reps in reserve or PE, or it could look like, okay, well, we want to do 3 to 5 sets today. If you're feeling good, go for the 5 sets. If you're feeling, it's an average day, do the 4 sets. If you're feeling it's a kind of crappy day, do the 3 sets. We're using some form of that. It looks different for every client, but that's what we're doing. Some clients, again, like you can just be like, you're doing 3 sets across the board. We know exactly how you perform it. Nothing changes, and that's perfectly fine. But either way, we're still keeping an auto-regulatory mindset with regard to all of this stuff, So unless either of you have anything to say on that, there's 2 things I just want to finish up on. So do either of you have anything to say? Fantastic. So, and you touched on this earlier on, Gary, but in terms of excessive exercise and amenorrhea, this is something that we kind of have to pay attention to. Now, we generally are looking at nutrition first when we're dealing with amenorrhea, because generally that's usually the biggest lever that we have to pull. Generally you're going to see people, they might exercise a lot, but they're actually just eating a little. They're not eating enough. So we're going to be like, right, look, ideally we want to change the exercise if this is something that's really contributing to the amenorrhea, but realistically we're going to try to increase food first and foremost, because that's going to be the biggest determinant, right? But having said that, and like I've done a lot of research into this area, and I've helped a lot of clients regain their period. In my experience, we generally do have to reduce exercise somewhat, you know. Now, that doesn't mean if you're doing your 3 sessions of resistance training per week and you're dealing with amenorrhea, we're going to have to go down to 2 sessions per week. You know, like 3 sessions, 4 sessions in the gym, that's fine. But generally what we're talking about is when you're doing an excessive amount of cardiovascular training, or you're doing like, you know, 6 training sessions in the gym, and then you also happen to be a personal trainer and you teach like 4 spin classes a day. It's like, well, we need to do something with your overall energy expenditure, you know. But what are your thoughts here, Nicola? So you have a client comes to you, they say they've been dealing with amenorrhea, and you know they're training a lot. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so you have to look at a couple of different facets here. So it's not just the training, like you're saying, it's nutrition, but it's also like psychological stress as well. So you kind of need to deal with the 3 things there. And I suppose it's very easy to just dial in on just the nutrition, and not look at, you know, how much they're training, how they're eating around training as well. Do they have enough energy availability around the training sessions that they're doing? You know, are they doing huge cardio sessions in the morning and then also doing intermittent fasting? And so they're not eating until, you know, like 1 p.m. You know, on top of that, is there a lot of like psychological stress there from, you know, work, relationships, whatever it is? So you need to tackle like all of those things. Because amenorrhea essentially it is, you know, like a state where your body's physiologically stressed and suppressed. So you need to deal with each of those individually.
100%. Gary, your thoughts?
Jack, no, completely agree.
Yeah. So again, practically speaking, if you're dealing with this, and I can't remember if we did a podcast on this or we're going to do a podcast on this. I think we're going to do a podcast on this. But when you're dealing with this, well, yeah, the training is an important aspect of it. Like there's usually bigger levers to pull first and foremost, you know, like I'm always hesitant to be like, yeah, this is probably like training is something that someone enjoys. It's a stress reliever, even though it is a stressor as well. I'm like, look, I'm not going to change that massively. I'm going to let you do the stuff that you enjoy, but we're getting everything else sorted first. We're eating more, we're getting sleep better, you know, stress management techniques, whatever it is, we're doing all that stuff. And yeah, we might reduce training volume, especially if we're doing excessive amounts of cardiovascular training, like any high energy output training. But in reality, we're probably dealing with this from other aspects. But I wanted to bring it up in this episode because I know people think about this stuff and they're you know, you talk about the menstrual cycle and then you're like, well, I actually don't have a menstrual cycle, and what should I do with my training, you know? So that is something to consider. Now, obviously there are other aspects in terms of, you know, you could be pregnant, you could be postmenopausal or perimenopausal. So there are other things to consider, and we will talk about them in future episodes. But do you have something to say, Nicola?
No, it is a good point. Like you were saying, I mean, someone who loves their training, whether it's resistance training or cardiovascular training, taking them away from that can again be something that induces stress with them, even though it might be something that long-term might be a net beneficial thing. So it is about, you know, coaching them that we're going to be reducing, you know, volume, maybe taking away a few sessions, but in the long term, you're going to feel a lot better. So it's not just running. It might be someone that's doing maybe not even excessive HIIT training. Maybe they might be doing, you know, they might be going from no training to doing 3 or 4 HIIT classes a week. And again, you know, HIIT does reduce a lot of stress on the body. And even though you're exercising and it's a good thing, like our bodies can't really differentiate between that. And it's still just seeing, I suppose, this increase in stress on the body is increase in cortisol. And again, you're pairing that with maybe someone who is eating less and still has all the life stressors going on as well. So it is about, you know, coaching people that, okay, we're going to kind of take you away from training for a while, like in the short term. But again, this is going to be a huge overall benefit to you down the line once we kind of get you your regular cycle back.
100%. And then to kind of finish up the episode, are there any specific injuries that you see in women? Like Gary, you mentioned earlier on the ACL stuff. Like that is something that I know a lot of field athletes, you know, if you play, you know, GAA, soccer, whatever it is, you know, you tend to see a lot more ACL injuries in women. But other than that, are there any injuries that either of you are kind of like, that's something that I need to be aware of? You know, this is a female population, keep an eye on that.
Not massively, really. I mean, there are variations, as I said, in knee injuries. Like ACL is probably the most high profile one. Patellofemoral pain syndrome is another one that comes up. But like other than that, like there's not massive differences in musculoskeletal injury risk. At least, like there are bone injuries, as we mentioned, bone stress injuries. That kind of comes down more so to the low energy availability. Like, yeah, there might be some differences in the way forces are distributed, but I think the Reds low energy availability side of things probably covers most of that. Um, and then, of course, there are some, I guess, more nuanced injuries or conditions, if you will, like, for example, pelvic floor dysfunction, incontinence, stress incontinence in particular. There's been a few videos kind of that went viral about that recently of women deadlifting and just like being all over the floor, but like they take it in good spirit. Like they're kind of laughing at themselves and they're laughing at the guy in the gym who has to go and clean it up. It's pretty funny. But yeah, like, I mean, that kind of, it comes along with, obviously female anatomy, differences in female anatomy, but then I guess the stresses that come from lifting 300, 400, 500 pounds. If you're a very strong woman, it's very difficult for your pelvic floor to keep up with that sometimes. So that's something that can happen. You can have, pelvic pain is also something that there's differences in between males and females. I'm trying to think, is there anything else kind of significant there? Yeah, not really beyond that, I don't think.
Cool. Nicola?
Yeah, so just echoing what Gary said, pelvic floor is a huge one, and it's one I think that we don't think about enough. We only think about it in terms of women who've postmenopausal or women who've had babies, when actually there's a lot of women like in their 20s that are still suffering with pelvic floor dysfunction, may not even realize it. And you notice this a lot, I think, when you are training someone in the gym. So like if we think back to, like, a lot of women are just programmed to suck in their stomach like the entire time. Like we walk around daily like that, and like what we don't realize what we're doing there is, so we're inhaling, pushing the diaphragm down, which is putting tension on the pelvic floor, which can kind of put us in this like hypertonic state. So we're constantly like walking around like that. So when we're in the gym, and I'll see it even when girls are sending me videos of them doing exercise in the gym, they don't realize that they're just sucking in like the entire time when they're sending these videos. And between that and there's like, so they're sucking in, there's a huge amount of even differences and like excessive kind of pelvic rotation as well, again, which can put tension on the pelvic floor too. So you'll see a lot of women walking around with like an anterior like pelvic tilt, and again, just that excessive rotation can cause pelvic floor dysfunction, again, which has a knock-on effect even when you do get to the stage where you're having children and you're trying to come back to the gym. Your pelvic floor is in a hypertonic state, it doesn't know how to relax, and if it doesn't know how to relax, then when you need it for the times when you're in the gym, or even when you're coughing or sneezing or going up the stairs, because it doesn't know how to relax, it doesn't know how to like appropriately contract to the max level that we need it in those times when there's an increase in tension, if we're constantly have it under tension. So that's a huge issue that again is underappreciated in the younger population.
Yeah, and again, I want to reiterate the point there. It's like, this is a thing for all women, well, guys as well to an extent, but you generally see more effects of this in women. It's like, this can happen to you at any age. This is not just like, oh, that's something I have to think about after pregnancy or something. It's like, no, like this is something that you should be aware of at all times. But in terms of the injury stuff, like, in fairness, like the only stuff that I ever encounter is usually around knees, hips to an extent, because purely like female pelvis is, you're kind of in this battle between wanting to be able to walk and function like a normal human, and then also being able to give birth. It's like you have this is why evolution is, it has made it difficult for childbirth for humans. There is this kind of evolutionary battle here, right? So it usually is either downstream of that or upstream of that there's an issue presented. It could be the knees as a result of like, the angle of the what's that called, Q angle. Could also be, again, you see sometimes women have issues in terms of like pressing exercises because of that carry angle with their, like, they could have like maybe an elbow injury or elbow issue. I'm sure, Gary, you've seen this before as well. Or you see them like bench pressing and you're kind of like, oh, like it looks like their arms are not moving in the right way. Like you're kind of a little bit freaked out about that. Also, women tend to be a bit more like hypermobile. Like you'll see women like I'm hypermobile as well, so I can do it, but like they'll lock their arms out and it'll be like way more than you'd see like in a quote unquote normal arm lockout, and you're kind of like, Jesus, like need to pay attention to that. And usually it's not an issue, but it is something that potentially we need to be aware of. If you are a coach and you have a client that's they are very hypermobile, like we need to be very careful with actually strengthening their joints, etc. up. But yeah, the pelvic floor stuff, that's generally, something that you're going to have to deal with, something that you're going to have to actually pay attention to, educate yourself on that. But anyway, look, that's today's episode, the training side of things. Do you have either of you have anything to add? Anything you want that we didn't cover, or anything to touch on?
No, sir.
I don't think so. Just get out, get resistance training.
Fantastic. We are going to do a little bit more in terms of training around pregnancy and stuff, training around there's some differences at other life stages, but we'll talk about them in future. But for now, Gary, do you want to wrap this up?
Yeah, so we do have coaching spaces available, guys. If you guys and girls, if you would like to work with us, in a training capacity and a nutrition capacity, both, we'd be more than happy to work with you. You can find information about that in the description box below. That goes for the three of us and for the other coaches on our team. We also put out a lot of free information, so make sure you're following on Instagram at Triage Method, and also follow our YouTube channel, Triage Method. Basically, anywhere you'll find Triage Method. Okay, so just whatever platforms you use, you'll find Triage Method there. Make sure to subscribe, follow, and share the content. That goes to the podcast as well. So if you're enjoying the podcast, clearly we're putting a lot of effort in. These are long old episodes. If you get this far, fair play to you, and we'd really appreciate if you share it with a friend privately or publicly. And also leave a rating and review if you happen to have the chance. We have an email newsletter as well that goes out each week, and that's something that is, again, free content that doesn't go on our social media, and you can keep up with that too. Maybe you don't use social media, you just want to use your inbox, and then you can find that useful content. Other than that, that's pretty much everything from us.
Yeah, other than that, I'm all good. So let's wrap this up. I hope everyone enjoyed themselves. And Nicola, do you want to have any final parting words for our adoring audience?
No, and have a good week, guys. That's my
Happy Easter. If you ate loads of this is coming out tomorrow, isn't it?
No, this is not coming out for another 2 weeks.
Never mind. I was going to tell you that not to starve yourself for the week because you had a chocolate egg, for God's sake. But never mind. 2 weeks time, I'll be amidst my exams. I mightn't even be alive.
Nice. All right. Anyway, we will see everyone in the next episode.